and thank you for making that distance viewable. Good morning. There's great turnout, and it's nice to see all of you, especially the people who are standing. It's a little bit of pressure. You have to be super good to get people to be willing to stand for that amount of time. So I'm going to talk about formal meetings for PDUFA products and best practices for communication during drug development. Most of you will find that very familiar as they are parts of the titles to two different guidances. So let's talk about the guidances a little bit. So the drafts were published in 2015 as part of PDUFA 5. And before we go much further, the user fee agreements are a place where FDA and industry sit down and they compare notes. I would like to have a goal for meetings, usually comes from industry. And FDA says, okay, we'll have a goal, let's talk about what our goals should be. And they come to an agreement and you have the PDUFA commitment letters. And it's an iterative process about every 5 years. So as part of PDUFA 5, the best practices for communication between IND sponsors and FDA during drug development guidance for industry and staff was published in December 2015. Informal meetings between the FDA and sponsors or applicants of PDUFA products was published in March of 2015. They both had a comment period where we received comments to the docket. We also, in various public venues at DIA, through our web pages, through our email addresses, accepted comments and took that advice and preference and wish list into consideration when we were looking at revising the guidances. We also, thankfully, had enough lead time to take into consideration PDUFA 6 requirements, which went into effect October 1st of 2017. But because we had some lead time, we were actually able to have them included in our guidance when it went through the clearance process and was published in 2017, December 2017. It's only a couple of months. It's unusual that it works out that way. Normally, we wouldn't know the information until after we worked on the drafts and would have to have another iterative process. So this is really a nice thing. So the formal meetings was republished as, again, in draft form because it contained a lot of new information and it was a PDUFA 6 requirement to have a draft period for comment. The best practices guidance was finalized in 2017. It does not have a PDUFA 6 requirement other than to work with an outside evaluation agency to look at how the communication process works, and depending on what comes from that, we can choose to revise the guidance. So the first thing we're going to look at is some of the big components of the meeting guidance. So in the meeting guidance, Type A meetings are necessary for an otherwise stalled product development program to proceed or to address an important safety issue. This hasn't changed. So some examples of a Type A meeting would be for dispute resolution, for clinical holds, post-action meetings. If it was requested within 3 months of issuance, that's something that came out of PDUFA 5. Type B meetings, really just a list of examples, things that aren't Type A, pre-IND, pre-emergency use authorization meetings, pre-NDA BLA, and post-action meetings requested 3 or more months after the action. Now you'll notice there are a couple of them that are missing that were there for PDUFA 5. They have their own category now. This is the big new thing, Type B, end of phase meetings. The meetings that fall into that category are certain end of phase 1 meetings and end of phase 2 or pre-phase 3 meetings. And they'll have different goal parameters around them as well. So Type C meetings, it's everything that doesn't fit into Type A, Type B, or Type B end of phase regarding the development and review of a product. There is a new meeting that's explicitly described in the Type C meetings, and that's for the use of a biomarker as a new surrogate endpoint that has never been previously used as the primary basis for product approval. So this is really, really new. Previously, in the PDUFA goals letters, what should be included in a meeting request content. So if you write to the FDA and you say, I would like to have a meeting, and you have your standard format, and those were all things 1 through 14, 1 through 11, whatever the number was, they were all shoulds. For some reason, in PDUFA 6, it was agreed upon that this list of things would become musts. In order to be counted as a meeting request and meet PDUFA goals for meetings, It needs to have these things: a brief statement of purpose, proposed meeting format, list of objectives and outcomes, proposed agenda with time frames for each item. And it's not that you have to get that down to the last millisecond. It's more just a few minutes around each one, or whatever your time frame is. That also helps us determine how much meeting time you're asking for, or how in-depth you think each topic will be. The list of sponsor-related attendees. And that seems kind of oddly worded. Instead of just saying related attendees, it's because a lot of times sponsors are really two companies, or they're bringing in a consultant group, or they're bringing in an expert. And it's really helpful to know who you plan to bring to the meeting so that we can have the appropriate people to meet with them. A list of requested FDA participants and disciplines. So again, this was a PDUFA 6 requirement, and in the guidance we go further and we say, hey, please break this out according to FDA's disciplinology, because it helps us identify. Some places say, oh, well, we're not bringing any chemists. But when you look at the list and you see what they do and have questions, it's like, you might put this in another discipline, but we consider this chemistry, and it's helpful to make sure we get the right folks. And the date the meeting package will be sent. And again, these are all musts. So meeting request response time. There was some confusion about whether it was calendar days or business days in various other versions of the guidance and in PDUFA, earlier iterations of PDUFA. But now in PDUFA 6, it's very explicit. It's calendar days. So for Type A, the response time to a meeting request is still 14 days. For Type B and Type C, it's still 21 days. But for our new category of Type B into phase, it's 14 days. Scheduling meetings. So scheduling meetings or written response timeframes are based on calendar days from the receipt of request. So for Type A, it's 30 days. Type B, it's still 60 days. Type B into phase, it's 70 days. So it's a beefier meeting. We get a little bit more time to schedule it to have the correct attendees, and a little bit more time with the meeting package. And Type C stayed at 75 days. Meeting packages. I'm going to get to the bullet at the bottom up front. I think the people who were sitting in the room were really trying to say, how can we say this simply, that we need a little heads up time to create a briefing package before the meeting if the meeting is scheduled really early. And instead of saying that, they came up with this bullet. If the scheduled date is earlier than the specified timelines, the meeting package will be no earlier than 6 days for Type B into phase and 7 days for Type C. It was really just kind of a way to say, hey, we're glad to go early, but give us a little bit of time to prepare. So there's a little bit of interesting math and counting, and nobody is going to ding you for a day here or there, but it should be agreeable to both sides. So for Type A, meeting packages are due at the time of the request. For Type B, they're due 30 days. I gave that a new because previously it was a month before, and months had different days. So this is just simple. 30 days, it's no confusion on anyone's part. Type B into phase is 50 days, and Type C is 47. I have no explanation for that. But it is. And everybody in the room agreed to it, and it went forward, and we'll see if it stays that way for PDUFA 7. So preliminary responses. This is something that we really kind of included more formally in the previous version, the first draft of this, and it was very well received. And as part of PDUFA 6, they said, hey, we'd like a little more time for these beefier meetings, and they agreed upon 5 days for Type B into phase and Type C meetings. So this is no later than before the meeting. So 2 days for A and B, 5 days for the other two categories. And again, they wanted to be really clear that this was not applicable to written responses only. So if you're getting written responses, you're not going to get a preliminary look at that. So again, this is, I guess, an intention to have kind of a really simplified way of describing responses to preliminary responses, but it doesn't just trip off the tongue. So once the sponsors have the preliminary responses, they should contact the FDA within a specified time frame. And it was written in terms of days after they received the preliminary responses. So for A and B, because the sponsors really only get those 2 days before the meeting, there's no goal for that. But for B into phase and for C, it's 3 days after they get their responses. And again, not applicable to written responses only. So we're going to switch gears. Those were the big major changes for the meetings guidance. We're going to look at the best practices for communication guidance now and go back over the highlights and what's new in it as well. So FDA's communication philosophy hasn't changed. PDUFA 5 asked us to explain this, and we received nothing but positive comments on how it was explained and set up, so we've kept it moving forward. So FDA and IND sponsors have a shared goal of early availability of safe, effective, and high-quality drugs. What's different is we have different primary responsibilities. So sponsors' primary responsibilities would be managing the overall drug development, soliciting input and guidance from FDA, determining the nature and timing of regulatory submissions, and providing complete and well-organized submissions. FDA has 3 slides of responsibilities. So on the first one, it's our responsibility to ensure the safety and rights of subjects and the quality of scientific evaluation of drugs. We're also responsible for enforcing good clinical practice and human subject protection requirements. Want me to go back? So we have additional 3 other responsibilities that kind of fall under the general categories, and that's to review IND submissions, to provide feedback on trials and development programs, and to take regulatory actions. A big umbrella responsibility that isn't necessarily immediately apparent in most situations is our responsibility to promote and advance regulatory science. And we do that by conducting and participating in public workshops, collaborating with academia, authoring guidances, publishing, and presenting at professional conferences. So this is new. The biosimilars, or BSUFA user fee folks, love the best practices guidance so much that even though they were implicitly included, they said, we want our name called out. We want to see our name. We want to know that without a doubt this applies to us. So as part of their negotiations, they asked us to explicitly state in the guidance parameters that it applies to communications during biosimilar biologic product development. And we were more than happy to. We also included information about the biosimilar meeting types in the guidance. So BSUFA critical juncture meetings include biosimilar initial advisory, or BIA meetings, and BPD type 1 through type 4 meetings. And all of those are intended to support an iterative process of interactions during the development phase. And they are based on the stage of development and the amount and type of data and information provided. So a BIA meeting is an initial assessment limited to general discussion. It doesn't include any meeting that involves substantive review of summary data or full study reports. BPD type 1 meetings are ones that are necessary for an otherwise stalled drug development program. This looks kind of similar to the PDUFA meetings. So clinical hold discussions, dispute resolution, special protocol assessment, or to address an important safety issue. BPD type 2 meetings are to discuss a specific issue or questions where targeted advice would be provided. They can include substantive review of summary data, but it generally doesn't include like a review of full study reports. So BPD type 3 meetings are an in-depth data review and advice meeting for an ongoing program. And that includes substantive review of full study reports, advice regarding the similarity between the proposed and the reference product, and advice regarding additional studies, including design and analysis. BPD Type 4, a pre-submission meeting to discuss the format and content of a complete application for an original biosimilar biological product application under the program or supplement submitted under 351K of the PHS Act. So we, again, very clearly stated that biosimilars were included, and we'll see how they respond, and if they would like additional information or we get additional comments on other things to include, we'll be happy to include that as well. One of the other big sections of the best practices guidance is the resources for sponsors section. That's something that's open 24/7, regardless of the time zone you're in, it's available to you. So that's why we develop and maintain web pages, portals, databases. We participate in interactive media, and it's all to provide self-service tools. Use of those tools allows more effective use of limited FDA resources in providing advice, so we can provide advice on scientific and regulatory issues that fall outside of established guidance, policy, and procedures. Now, if you really have a general question and you don't know where to find it, or you can't find it in a search, please reach out to us. We're happy to help that. But if it's something you can find on your own, and that leads to a more complex question that does fall outside of established advice, that means we've done our job with our publicly available information. So this year, we added the FDA-funded scientific research results, but because they're so important, we're going to go through all the resources available. So guidance documents. They explain our current thinking on policy, scientific, or regulatory issues. So for each one of these, there's going to be a web page location. The one for guidances and the one for maps are search engine based. You can put in a topic. You can put in part of the title and really see what's available there. The beauty of using this web page search engine to find what you're looking for is that it returns the current version. If you type in PDUFA meetings, FDA, into Google or Ask or whatever your search engine of choice is, it may well return something that is no longer in use, that's been retired by the FDA. And your information would then be superseded and you wouldn't even know it. So again, CDER's maps describe internal policies and procedures. The map page, again, you can search by title or keyword, but you can also search by map number. So if you're a number person and you know all your maps, you can look for 6030.9 and find it. I see some happy smiles. Basics for industry. This provides basic information about FDA regulatory processes and resources to better understand how to work with FDA. At least it's how we think we can help you better understand. If you have different thoughts and you want to provide information or a better way to do it, there is a way to submit questions and comments on that web page. There's industry frequently asked questions, so once a question reaches a certain threshold, we'll add that to our FAQs and talk a little bit about it because it's something that a lot of people want to know. There's also popular content that's based on the number of clicks on that web page. And then, thankfully, there's an A to Z index for those that alphabetize things. You can go and search for things that way. FDA has a huge presence in interactive media. We use it to communicate information about emerging science, new policy and procedures, public advisory committee meetings, and workshops. We're on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, basically anything that's come out within the past 10 years, we try to have a presence on. You can find videos where folks have recently spoken with their speeches from FDA. You can get updates of what's going on with Twitter if a new guidance is released. It's amazing what's publicly available. We also have a warehouse for FDA presentations. So all of this is CDER related. They can range from topics on user fees, drug advertising and marketing, genomics, over-the-counter products, anything you can think of, it might well be there. If not, again, if you want to see something about it, send a message. We also have a webpage for FDA labeling and approvals. So our Drugs at FDA database contains information about CDER-regulated FDA-approved products. You can search by drug, by active ingredient, or by application number. You can also browse by drug. You can look for approval information here. So we have that for NDAs and BLAs, for supplements to those, for original ANDAs, and for tentative approvals. Rules and regulations. This webpage contains information about notice and comment on rulemaking, review of proposed and final rules, and related resources, which is a really nice plain language version of what FDA regulates and who regulates it. It's a very nice resource. This is our new one for this version of the Best Practices Guidance. It's FDA-funded scientific research results, and the philosophy behind it is that the broad availability of scientific information and underlying data allow for the critical review, replication, and verification of findings, as well as accessible and analyzable findings in supporting digital data, promote robust and open communication, and bolsters scientific credibility and regulatory decision-making based on those findings. This is actually a work in progress. So we have the web page, and they talk about the mandate, but they describe what the web page is going to look like in the future. It's not fully functional yet. So it will provide educational resources about public access policies and the tools for complying once it's built. And I think Kevin already talked about the CFR, so he showed you the books, the Code of Federal Regulations, and it codifies the federal government rules published in the Federal Register. And each year that they're printed, they get a different color. If you've been with the FDA long enough, you have your rainbow of CFRs. Then there's the opportunity to look at the eCFR, which is fantastic. It is technically considered an unofficial compilation of CFR material and Federal Register amendments, but it's updated more frequently, several times a month. And you can search by topic, you can search by number, anything that you'd like to know. You can just browse and read through. And you don't have to carry a bunch of paper. Another great section of the Best Practices Guidance is the additional contacts. It is for basic or procedural drug development questions not directly linked to an existing or planned development program. So if you're really calling about something you want to do with your IND and it's very specific, this is not the place for that. That would generally be the review division. This is if you just have a, hey, where do I go to find this information? What is the basic policy about this? Or what is the process about that? And we added 4 this year. They're very important, so I'm going to go through them all. So the Biomarker Qualification Program, their webpage contains information, contact information, and information about the biomarker process, but they provide a framework for development and regulatory acceptance. And the web pages themselves are updated quite frequently. If I took a picture 2 weeks ago, a screenshot, it might well change by the time I come up here. So check back often. The controlled substance staff, they respond to inquiries about the drug scheduling process and the study of abuse potential in animal and human studies. DDI, Division of Drug Information, they provide expert advice and guidance regarding all aspects of CDER activities to consumers, healthcare professionals, insurance companies, regulated industry, academia, law enforcement, other parts of FDA, and other government agencies. So the Division of Pediatric and Maternal Health, they collaborate with internal and external stakeholders to develop clinically relevant, evidence-based labeling and other communications that facilitate informed use of medicines in children and women of childbearing potential. you'll notice they don't quite have a web page, but they do have email addresses, one for pediatric questions and one for maternal health questions. And by the next version, hopefully they'll have a web page. The other new item that we have this year is the Emerging Technology Team. So they respond to external inquiries on novel technologies. Their webpage initially started with basically a reference to draft guidance, and they've built it into a great reference tool. And again, it contains contact information, places to send questions. So the next one is the Enhanced Communication Team. They respond to general questions about the drug review process. They could help clarify which O&D review division to contact with a question. And the situation arises, they provide assistance with resolving communication challenges with the review team. In the guidance itself, it talks through that communication challenge process. And it's almost all common sense. It's things like, hey, if you don't hear back, try to contact again. Keep in mind the time frame, a reasonable time frame for a response based on the question you're asking. If it's for a submission that you're going to submit 6 months from now, do you really need an answer in 2 hours? If it's for an emergency or a safety issue, you might need a response in 2 hours, and so you would escalate more quickly. Each project manager should have out-of-office contact information in case you get a bounce-back message. You would also be able to follow up with the CPMS, and barring that, then the division management, which could be the division director or the deputy division director. And after all of that, if you're still having challenges, you would contact the Enhanced Communication Team. This is something that we reported on for PDUFA 5 and have yet to have a communication challenge rise to the level of needing to be reported. So hopefully it's a good sign that we're taking care of things as they come up. But I want you to feel free to reach out if you do have challenges. Import-export is a contact that responds to questions related to general compliance and export certificates. It's really nice the way they have their website set up currently. It's very clear to see who you need to contact with what type of question. Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. We looked at the guidance, and when we were writing it, and they were even on the working group and didn't notice that we didn't have contact information. So there's always an opportunity to improve, and we added their webpage. They have a bunch of different branches and divisions and very specific pathways for different types of questions, but it's all laid out on their webpage. The Ombudsman, and this is the CDER Ombudsman. They provide informal advice. They assist with issues or challenges that might arise during the review process. They also like to hear about how CDER's programs and overall performances are going. If you have comments and you have thoughts, share them with the Ombudsman. With the Ombudsman, upon request, your communication can be kept confidential. The Rare Disease Contact, they exchange scientific and regulatory information with international regulatory agencies, and they also promote the development and treatments by collaborating with internal and external rare disease stakeholders. And I think last iteration they did not have a web page; they only had email addresses, and we've moved up to a web page now. So we're using that as peer pressure for pediatric and maternal health. They're the only one left. Another contact is Small Business and Industry Assistance. They provide human drug product development and regulation information. And last but not least is the Therapeutic Biologics and Biosimilar staff. They also, during the process of writing the best practices guidance this go around, built a web page and provided an email address for questions. So we call them TBVS staff. So the TBVS staff ensures consistency in the scientific and regulatory approach and advice regarding development programs for therapeutic biologics and for proposed biosimilar products. And before I talk about the Office of Special Medical Programs, we focused on the CDER portion of the guidance. There is CBER-specific information for contacts and for additional resources, but that's unchanged from the last version. So the Office of Special Medical Programs, they have 5 areas that they cover. The first one is the advisory committee, oversight and management staff. They provide guidance and assistance on the establishment, staffing, and management of public advisory committees. If you wanted to see the calendar, this is where you would go. If you wanted to see the meeting materials, they would be on this page. The Office of Combination Products, they address pre-marketing review and post-marketing regulation questions. They also provide training to FDA staff and to industry, and they classify products. The Office of Good Clinical Practice plans and conducts training and outreach programs. They respond to good clinical practice and human safety protection questions. The Office of Orphan Products Development, they have a bunch of programs from orphan drug designation, humanitarian use device, rare pediatric disease priority review vouchers, and then a whole list of grants. Orphan Products, Pediatric Device Consortium, and Orphan Products Natural History. The Office of Pediatric Therapeutics has 5 programs. They cover scientific activities, ethics, safety, international, and neonatology. Any questions? Right, I think we lost Jeff.
Okay, our first online question is, how does a sponsor request a free pre-IND consultation meeting as presented in the previous presentation? What are the steps? Where can the specific instructions be found? Is this the same process for biologics? Is it the same as the initial advisory meeting?
Oh, that's a lot of questions all in one. So your best bet is to look at the formal meetings guidance, because it will tell you how to request that type of meeting. It tells you where you can download all the different parameters. It leads you to other web pages. It's not a simple, straightforward question that you push a button and send your questions here. It's a pretty involved process. And no, biosimilar meetings are not the same as PDUFA meetings, but biosimilars also has a meetings guidance, and I suggest you look there. So once you've done that, this is where your additional contacts or your resources come in really handy. Send your general questions there, and they'll help get you to the right place. Contact the enhanced communication team. We'll help you get to the right review division within O&D. And if I can figure out where you need to go in CBER, I'll hand you off to their communication team, and they will help you. Any more questions? Oh.
Hi. I have a question about...
Oh, no, a notes question.
I'm sorry, what?
A notes question.
Yes, a notes questions.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so you were saying that the response from the sponsor for preliminary responses from FDA are due within 3 days.
So this is where I was explaining that I don't know exactly what the people in the room were thinking when they came up with how this time frame is described. So I'm looking for the slide so we can look at it together. So this describes the situation where the preliminary responses have been sent to the sponsor.
Right.
Okay. So for Type B end of phase and Type C meetings, that's done 5 days prior to the meeting.
Okay.
The preliminary responses? Okay.
I'm sorry, what's done 5 days before the meeting?
The preliminary responses are sent to the sponsor
5 days before.
5 days prior to the meeting.
And that's calendar days, or? Okay, that's great.
So for response to preliminary responses, the 3 days, so it's 3 days after it's been received. So if you get them on day 4,
yeah,
it's due, you subtract 3, 1 day before the meeting.
okay.
You get them on day 5, it's due 2 days before the meeting.
Okay.
Get them on day 3, technically they're not due, but if you have the information, I encourage you to send it because it helps the meeting run more smoothly.
Okay,
And,
so if we wind up on day 3, and it's the day before the actual meeting, is that close of business, 5 p.m.? Or
Instead of getting, again, this is not something that's tracked. This is where industry responds and kind of narrows down the focus of the meeting. If you send it at 8 o'clock at night and we see it the morning of, that's still going to be helpful. This is to set a goal. And the goal is, hey, give it to us 3 days after you get it.
Okay. Just one quick follow-up question.
No problem.
You mentioned written responses only. So at meeting requests granted, written responses only. I don't think you really discussed that. And can
No,
you
because
comment?
it's not new, but go ahead.
Can you comment on the frequency of those and what the criteria is? In other words, what I find is we wind up in a circuitous pattern of continually requesting these meetings, and they wind up being written responses only, and we don't get benefit of a face-to-face meeting or a teleconference.
So that sounds like a really specific issue, other than, hey, what is the criteria and what's the general approach? So what I can do is talk to you offline, and we can look at the guidance to get quickly or too frequently. Your pathways for resolving that are with the review division, through ECT, through the ombudsman. So you have options. So that's the general response. But I'm happy to talk to you after
That would be
and help
great.
you through.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh.
And then we'll take one more in the room and one more online.
Yeah, so I was curious, what is the agency's current thinking in terms of parallel scientific advice with EMA? Are there any advancements there, or now that it's been available for some time, is there any experience with that process? Are FDA encouraging that? And is there any effort to align kind of the timelines, et cetera, between those two to try to make it a more advantageous avenue to pursue?
And you asked a very thoughtful and well-designed question, and it's way outside of the scope of what we're talking about here. I'm sorry. But if you will give me your contact information, I'll see about getting you to the right place. But that's not within the PDUFA or best practices, and I'd hate to make podium policy.
And let's take one online question, and then we'll wrap up for lunch.
Regarding the meeting request, can you explain the difference between the purpose of the meeting and the list of objectives or outcomes the requester expects from the meeting?
So, off the top of my head, I would say think about that as a purpose statement and then a more defined supporting list or set of examples of what you'd like to have. So, the brief statement of purpose. What is your purpose? Are you developing a product? Are you wanting to, trying to think of examples. Are you wanting to add an indication? So that's a very broad purpose, and it's brief. So the specific outcomes, objectives list, usually this is in the form of questions, but it's not required to be depending on the meeting type. But this is, hey, what do you want to get to? This is the meat. This is a more drilled down version.
Okay. And that's all the time we have for questions. Please help me thank Rachel for coming to talk to us today. Excellent job, Rachel. Thank you very much. 2 quick housekeeping items. We're about to go on a lunch break. While you're on the lunch break, these tables here are going to disappear and magically turn into 2 rows of chairs. So if